Tutti i partecipanti sono in grado solo di ascoltare.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Roberto Vigotti. I'm the secretary of this foundation. You just saw a video highlighting our role, and very pleased to welcome you to this special event dedicated to South Africa energy transition. Today, we will be looking specifically at the decarbonization of South Africa economy with a possible roadmap, a topic that has been taking much more significance after the COP26 in Glasgow. In fact, we know that in the lead up of the conference, South Africa revised its NDC, National Declared Commitment, and they aligned with a more ambitious global approach. So it's a proof that the commitment of the government to these goals. During the COP, it was also announced that South Africa decarbonization effort now received a boost also by the 8.5 billion pledged by European Union, France, Germany, UK, and US to transition South Africa from coal to renewable. This means that South Africa is currently living a pivotal moment for the sustainable future. Now is the time in which South Africa has to take advantage of also the international support and lay out a clear, ambitious strategy and the tools to reach this strategy, to give legitimacy to the just transition for their country. RES4Africa is very active in South Africa, and now today, together with the EFRI, our member consultant, we produce a report which sets out a possible roadmap for the country decarbonization, which will be presented later in this session, and as we said before, will be sent to all of you after the event. It's a possible roadmap, mostly take into account the role of the private sector who wants to come and co-invest with you in South Africa. Of course, before the study, we have an outstanding group of speakers which will discuss how to approach, finance, and achieve South Africa's decarbonization. I'm really honored to have with me the regulatory member of NERSA, Muzi Nkize, of course, the director of the climate direction, Raffaele Petticcione. We know him very well. We work together for the guarantee in Africa. And of course, Steve Nichols, the head of the Climate Mitigation Presidential Commission, my friend De Benin, Benabey, and Peter, so on. But before to go ahead, I just like to introduce you Nonti or Nonto Kodzo Knosi, a co-opted board member at the South Africa Wind Energy Association, and of course also involved in the private sector in the commercial office of Energy Green Power in South Africa. Nonti, the pleasure to give the floor to you, and thank you for joining us and being our moderator. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much, Roberto, for that introduction. It is indeed an honor to be moderating this session, and especially considering the timing, as you've highlighted, coming out of COP26. It is the timing of this discussion is quite significant. If you consider South Africa being one of the most carbon-intensive economy, it is quite imperative to follow the clear intent that has been made by the government in order to decarbonize the economy, but it needs to be followed up with real action. So I really look forward to this conversation. I really look forward to unpacking all the various dimensions that will assist South Africa in the roadmap towards decarbonization. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for this morning. His name is Mr. Muzi Wiseman Nkize, who is the full-time regulator at the NERSA, which is the South African energy regulator for South Africa. Just to give you a brief background on Mr. Nkize, he started his career at Sasol, where he held various positions. He has moved to other organizations, such as the National Prosecuting Authority. He has worked at the DMRE as a director of hydrocarbons. And prior to joining NERSA, he spent some time briefly as head of economic development and tourism for Mpumalanga provincial government. He holds a master's in business leadership and a Bachelor of Commerce, as well as a Bachelor of Science, Chemical Engineering. He has extensive experience in the energy sector, having worked within the industry as well as within policy formulation, administration, and regulation. He has served on various multilateral and bilateral structures as government or country representative. These includes, among others, serving as Vice Chair of Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum from 2019 to 2010, Guest Commissioner for South Africa, Mozambique Guest Commission, and for South Africa, Namibia Guest Commission from 2008 to 2016. Mr. Nkize also serves as a director on boards of various state-owned entities in the energy and economic development sector. So, Mr. Nkize, we really look forward to your presentation, and I think it is quite important to have clear policy and regulation which enables and fosters any transformation or any a roadmap to what South Africa has highlighted. So please, if you are ready to take us through your presentation, we are ready and look forward to it.
I wonder if you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you so much, Mr. Nkize. Hi, Muzi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Are you able to see your presentation?
Yes, I'm able to see my presentation. It's all systems go now. Thanks
so much
for the kind words in your introduction. I would just like to quickly go through this one, as for me, it's to talk to the regulatory framework that is necessary for reaching the South African net zero carbon dioxide emissions target. And go to the next slide, which basically presents the outline, where I will talk to the net zero definition thereof, and then look at the net zero pathway, the global net zero pledges, as well as South African, the contributions there, national determined contribution targets as of September 2021. Then talk to the South African total gross national greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. Then move on to the role of governments. Move to policy and regulatory framework by sector, look at energy transition developments in South Africa, and then the funding of the pathway, and then provide some closing remarks prior to then getting any questions being posed and discussion ensuing. May proceed. In instance, when we're talking of the net zero, we're looking at a situation where there's a balance. This is a net zero balance in terms of the emissions into the atmosphere and the removal of those emissions. So it's a balance between the emission sources and the sinks. May please just move the presentation for me? Yes, as I've outlined prior, that the term net zero is important because this is a state of which global warming stops. As the outlined the Paris agreements, that there's a balance that is achieved between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century, looking at 2015 as the time frame to achieve that. Next slide, please. These are then the global net zero pathway. As you will see, the International Energy Agency pathway details more than 400 sectoral and technological milestones to guide the global journey to net zero by 2050. And for us as South Africa, it is very challenging because you will understand that we are a fossil fuel-based economy, with coal playing a major role. And though we don't have significant resources of oil and gas as such, with our gas to liquid plant in Moses Bay having actually almost shut down because of lack of gas. But we do have a lot of coal, to the extent that we even are having a coal to liquid plant in Secunda, owned by Sasol, which is now operated also to include gas that is drawn from Mozambique. So you could see the challenge that we face, with also the issue of looking at 2021 being the new unabated coal plants approved for development. If you start just to look at that in the beginning, it is very steep and challenging for a coal-based economy. But we've got to then move along with the whole world, as you understand that the challenges that we face. Let's then proceed to the next one. I think what you see is that around about 2050, you then have 85% of the buildings actually complying with the requirements. This net zero pathway actually requires then the net zero pledges that you globally made in terms of the national determined contributions and other mitigation pledges for 2030, which gives a 66% chance of the world hitting a global temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius, which then to keep this global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius this century, the world needs to urgently put additional plans and action in place to almost halve annual greenhouse gas emissions in the next 8 years. So the net zero plans, if implemented effectively and reflected in the as reflected in the NTCs, they could go a long way to close the gap. 49 countries have pledged, and this makes up about more than half of the global domestic greenhouse gas emissions, and more than half of gross domestic product, and a third of global population. Or as you will appreciate that with 195 countries in the world, we've got less than almost a quarter of those. But if you consider the population in this and the economies of these countries, these more than the G20 members have indeed pledged net zero emissions, and all countries should actually increase the robustness of the net zero pledges. But of importance for me is also the need that all net zero pledges should be backed by near-term actions that give confidence that they can be achieved. So it is important that there's some credibility to these net zero pledges. Move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of South Africa, we've got also the nationally determined contribution targets as of September 2021, where South Africa actually looks at by 2025, the annual greenhouse gas emissions will be in the range from 398 to 510 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then by 2020 to have that in the range of 350 to 420 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. But there are challenges to that, because we need to have a well-resourced just transition strategy, which strategy the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy is also busy developing to shift us to low carbon technologies and maximize the benefit and minimize the adverse impacts on communities, workers, and the economy as a whole. And then the targets have been set on the assumption that the support will be provided to South Africa as a developing country, as set out in the Paris Agreements, Articles 9, 10, 11, and 13. The other issue is that there will be a need to increase the level of mitigation ambition, particularly in the electricity sector, with the bulk of our electricity actually coming from coal. There are these coal-fired power stations, with the two recently built ones. And then the shift away from coal, as articulated in the Integrated Resource Plan of 2019, which then requires the support in the form of finance, associated technology, and capacity building initiatives. Capacity building is actually very close to my heart, because if you want to see development in a country, you must actually develop its main assets, which are its people. And then the COVID-19 crisis has actually exacerbated these challenges. May move on, please. You will note here, this actually just seeks to talk to the issue of total gross national greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. You will see that whenever we're talking climate change, energy then just comes in because of its major contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore posing a challenge to all the initiatives. Hence, the focus then becomes more on the on the energy. But there are also industrial processes that also contribute a lot to that, as well as the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. There is also the issue of waste. You can see the contribution, as well as if you look at the graph here, how much electricity generation actually contributes to that, with the 42%, and then the industrial processes 27%, with transport contributing 10%. I think currently South Africa ranks the highest when it comes to transport emissions. One article was just alluding to that in the, I think last week, highlighting that, as you can see on agriculture, the commercial, residential, and the waste side. So this is just gives you the picture, and therefore when one applies the Pareto principle, one sees that you need then to focus on the energy sector, and then move on, but not forgetting all these other sectors, because they do make a significant dent in this regard. Let's move on to the next one, please. The role of governments. You will note that the EU, for example, and China was looking at reaching the carbon neutrality by 2060. And then it's also important to note that China particularly also aims to become a major supplier for other countries in the global race to decarbonize. It is already a leader in green technologies. And I think this is another aspect that you need to be able to look at as a government to say, how do you then optimize the benefits and the spin-off that come in the decarbonization drive. In EU, you will note that they actually are focusing on 3 levers, being tougher regulations and emission standards for industry, carbon pricing and taxes on polluters, as well as rules to promote investment in low emissions technology. In South Africa, particularly, the president has also underscored that the issue of the need to get support to then enable the transition to the net zero and phase out fossil fuels, that the developing countries then need to assist in terms of massively scaled up, predictable and appropriate means of implementation support. You note also that the government's role also includes educating people, funding research and development, providing network for knowledge exchange, providing protecting intellectual property, using public procurement to boost deployment, helping companies innovate, and investing in enabling infrastructure, as well as setting regulatory frameworks for market and finance. For me, as a regulator, the last point of regulatory frameworks for market is of interest. We move to the next slide, please. This year, in terms of the role of government in South Africa in particular, we've got the Paris Agreement coming under the UNFCCC. And then you note that in South Africa, these contributions as targets were formulated in the context of, amongst other things, the environmental rights that are set out in the Constitution, in Section 24 of the Constitution, as well as the National Development Plan, which then provides a 2030 vision to guide the country's sustainable development trajectory and poverty, where poverty is eliminated and inequalities are reduced by 2030. The implementation of the 2030 vision is further elaborated in the climate policy, the National Climate Change Response Policy, the climate compatible sectoral plans, and the National Sustainable Development Strategy. Good progress has been made in implementing climate compatible sector plans, such as integrated energy planning, as well as the integrated resource plan, which is the electricity generation plan of 2019, which currently is being implemented. And I think it's going to be important as we go along to review that and kind of tweak it here and there. There is also industrial action, a policy action plan known as IPAP, and then the net growth path. All of these, the new growth path, I mean, all of these actually they then fit in to the low emissions development strategy of February 2020. You may move to the next one. So there are all these national planning instruments, the national policy, and as well as the analytical tools. With that, then come these high-level plans where you've got the South African emissions development strategy towards 2050, and then there is this plan, the NTP, which a large part of it has actually been replaced by the economic recovery and reconstruction plan, which in the midst of COVID-19, the downgrading of South Africa's sovereignty rating, credit rating, as well as the recession that was experienced, it's of utmost importance. And then with energy in particular, there is a white paper on energy policy of 1998, which by and large remains relevant and actually help to guide as it advocates for an energy mix. So there are, below that, there are various pieces of legislation and sector-specific policies. At NERSA, we're responsible for the administration of the Petroleum Pipelines Act, the Gas Act, and the Electricity Regulation Act, as well as the implementation of other the regulations as well as policies, particularly if in the area of electricity, looking at the integrated resource plan for the generation part of electricity of 2019. Below that, then, are various regulatory frameworks and the implementation thereof. There are different rules and methodologies, as well as the issue of regulatory advocacy. We have noticed also, some of you know that now people that are going to generate 100 megawatt, they don't necessarily have to get a license, which is a longer process. They can simply register, which is also a move towards enabling a lot of these the small scale embedded generators to then come to the fore without having to go through a lot of red tape. May proceed to the next one, please. The regulatory framework in terms of the energy, as I said, there's this integrated energy plan, there's the integrated resource plan, and then other opportunities like the biofuels opportunity, where we've got a biofuels regulatory framework that has been put in place. This is now coming from the supply side. And I think that it's also important to look at energy from the demand side and also be able to then look at it and say what energy carrier will actually best serve or meet the demand. Where you've got actually the National Energy Efficiency Strategy that seeks to then ensure that there is a efficient use of energy. And then also the solar water heaters in terms of increasing the uptake thereof. The national building regulations and building standards were put in place. The promotion of cleaner mobility with the 2007 public transport strategy that is actually in place now, as well as the 2018 green transport strategy. Looking at how then this can be, we can improve, particularly on the transport sector, noting the contributions, which earlier on, I hope you recall that it was sitting at 10%. And then in September 2010, a carbon tax was introduced on the selling price of new motor vehicles that exceed a certain emission limit. Next slide, please. There are also cross-cutting, in terms of the regulatory framework, cross-cutting aspect, where in addition to the measures of specific to individual sectors, there's also these cross-cutting measures, particularly looking at the issue of carbon tax, the sector emission targets, as well as the carbon budgets. On the industry side, there is this IPAP that I mentioned earlier on, as well as the National Industrial Policy Framework, which then also seeks to intervene in this regard. On the waste side, there is this National Waste Management Strategy, and on the agriculture, forest, and land use, there are interventions in terms of the climate change adaptation and mitigation plan for the South African agricultural and forestry sectors. There is also the conservation agriculture policy and the agroforestry strategic framework for South Africa. These have been developed, and I think it's very important for all these policies to be integrated, to talk to each other. Government has also tried to put in place a cluster system, which system then tries to make sure that there is harmony among this, and people are also not operating as silos as government departments. Please.
Hi, Mozi, are you still with us?
I think Mr. Kidze has some issues.
It seems that we are having we may be experiencing some technical difficulties with connecting with Mozi at the moment. While we are trying to reconnect him, I would probably just like to take a moment just to reflect on, I think, 3 points that Mr. Mkhize mentioned in his presentation.
We can move to the next one, please.
Okay, he's back. Thank you.
Can move to the next one. This now talks to the funding of the pathway, because we can all talk, but if there are no financial resources, everything actually comes to a standstill. There is a South African a green energy fund that was established with the assistance of also of the World Bank of Southern Africa, which should be the implementing agent of this green fund. The fund has had a total of 55 projects, and it disbursed 782 million to invest projects to support green economy initiatives in agriculture, mining, and transport, amongst others. The resources for the fund will have to be increased in the future to enable and support the scaling up of viable and successful initiatives, including contributions from domestic, private sector, and international resources. On the global scale, South Africa managed to source this 131 billion, which is the 8.5 billion US dollars for just energy transition over the next 3 to 5 years in the form of grants, concession loans, and investment and risk sharing instrument, including mobilizing private sector funding. These, the implementation of this will actually require both the state and the private sector to work together and ensure that it then address also the underlying challenges that South Africa face as a country, as a whole. Let's move to the next one, please. In my closing remarks, because there is policy and then there is the legislation that then flows, and then from the legislation you get the regulations as well as the rules in terms of being able to regulate the industry and get it moving in the right direction. The key issue here is that we have, as South Africa, we are not doing this without noting the context that we are operating under. One key issue that I just want to highlight here is the triple scourge that we face as a country, one of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. This is underpinned by the legacies of apartheid structural constructs, as well as settings. I know sometimes in 27 years down the line, people are saying we're still complaining about apartheid, but the structural arrangements still stay, and therefore we need to look at this, taking cognizance of the situation that the country finds itself in. And the very situation is aggravated by COVID-19 and unfavorable global economic climate. That being also must also underscore the issue of the downgrading of the sovereign credit rating of the country, as well as taking into consideration the real and perceived corruption. So we've got this challenge of unemployment. If you look, for example, at the NDP, it had a target of reducing unemployment to 15% by 2020. As we see, we've got 34.9% unemployment, as well as if you look at the youth particularly, you've got 66.5, which can be a recipe of a disaster if one considers the Arab Spring, for example, in the earlier years. And therefore saying that these things, they need drastic interventions to alleviate. So whatever we do, we need to have this context. Noting also the issue of poverty, where the rate was, we said the target was to reduce it to 25% by 2020. As we see, we are around about 36% at the moment. So the focus must also be on job creation through public works programs, employment guarantee schemes, and other intervention, which then this decarbonization need to be alive to that and respond to that. The issue of inequality, I think we are one of the countries, if not the most unequal society in the world. So we need to, the target was to reduce the Gini coefficient to about 0.55 by 2020. As we speak, we're sitting at around 0.62. So the issue of inequality actually even complicates the issue further, because you speak with one segment of society, they celebrate your achievement. You then go to the next society, they don't even care, they don't even want that. They are concerned with totally different issues. When you've got that, and you've got racism, you've got bigotry, and then you've got tribalism, that then becomes a recipe for disaster. What you want to actually ensure that there is social cohesion and there is pulling together in terms of achieving these goals. So these are the challenges that whatever we do, we need to be alive to and respond to. So the next slide, please, ma'am. So what I want to say here, so when we're looking at policy formulation, you're looking at because there is a need really to review our legislation. If one considers that most of these pieces of legislation, especially in the energy sector, they were enacted around in the early 2000s. So with the Electricity Regulation Act being 2006, the Pipelines Act being 2003, as well as the Petroleum Products Act 2005, was the latest amendment. The Gas Act is currently going through an amendment process. It's now at the later stages in Parliament. So what I want to emphasize is that this is not by faith, but by facts. It is neither a religion, although some people are religious about these things, nor is it ideological, because in terms of ideology, it may favor certain ideologies and even promote them, but it's not about that. It's about facts and being able to respond to that and deal with the challenge that the country as well as the globe is facing. Hence, then there's also a need for justice to be meted out through the right and effective energy transition policies, taking due regard of the triple scale that we're facing. So there's also to deal with the double jeopardy that the people are facing, because those who benefited from CO2 intensive development are not the ones that are facing these challenges. Those who did not benefit, they are the ones that are facing the brunt of climate change, as well as being worse. We don't want them to be worse off in the decarbonization drive. So the Just Energy Transition document is being developed by the DMRE, as I alluded to that. The issue of also in institutional arrangement to set decarbonization target is the role of government and not the regulators, but it's important to review policies and legislation to set parameters for regulation to take place. So for many countries, the security of supply and equitable access to energy are the most pressing concerns, and the initiative should focus on sustainable solutions to this problem. The issue of public-private partnership is key. Integration and synergistic collaborations amongst all stakeholders is very important. Advocacy, and when one looks at the private sector, lobbying is of key importance to be able to also be active. Activism is also important, because some people will not just have a balanced view and could be progressive, and therefore it is important to do that. These are just my closing remarks, and I think that as a country, if we can move quickly, we'll be able to have the right regulatory framework for decarbonization as a country, which should be beneficial for all the citizens. I will leave it at that and say thank you for the opportunity to Madam Kosi and your team.
Thank you so much, Muzi. It is quite encouraging to see, a regulator that is advocating for an update and for transformation when it comes to regulation. And the regulator's role is very important so that we can ensure absolute governance. And, I'd just like to, highlight on 3 points that you mentioned during your presentation today, which I think is very much links to our next speaker. But you mentioned, in order to achieve the target to net zero, the role of government, and you mentioned 3 critical areas, one being tougher regulations and emission standards for the industry, carbon pricing and taxes for polluters, and the third one being the roles to promote investment in lower emission technologies that needs to be in place. And I think those are 3 important, attributes in order to achieve net zero, and are very key in our role to decarbonization. So, and why that was important, I think that ties in very well with our next speaker. And I do know that my agenda is meant to have Mr. Raphael next. However, I would just like to do a quick switch and introduce Mr. Steve Nichols, who is the head of climate migration in the Presidential Climate Commission, who is going to unpack South African NDC and the regulations in place to achieve this. Just a quick bio on Steve. He is currently appointed as head of mitigation at South Africa's Presidential Climate Commission. In his role, Steve works with a range of stakeholders to reach consensus on net zero pathway for each sector of the economy, built on a strong fact base and supporting capacity building and cooperation within modeling community in South Africa. Understanding future competitive economies and what kind of investment are required to enhance South Africa's economic competitiveness while creating employment and reducing inequality and poverty with this key focus. So thank you so much, Stephen. And as I mentioned, I think this ties in quite well with the last closing remarks by Mr. Mkhize. So we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so I'm going to run through just a quick introduction on what the Presidential Climate Commission is, give you an introduction to the NDC itself in South Africa and the importance of ambition in that NDC, and then to talk a little bit about some of the realities of transition and some of the policy changes that we may need. So if I can ask you to jump onto the next slide, please. So the PCC is a multi-stakeholder body that was established by the President of South Africa. It has two components to it. One is the Secretariat, which is where I am based, that's sort of doing the underlying work. But we are guided by a series of commissioners that come from a range of society, from civil society, from business, from government, from labor, and from academia. And really our mandate is try to work out what South Africa's transition pathways look like, and manage those pathways and advise government on policy that will allow those pathways to make South Africa more competitive, but to create more jobs, reduce unemployment, reduce inequality, and reduce poverty, which is ultimately South Africa's primary concern. So that's kind of the background to the PCC. Jumping on to the next slide, please. So obviously there are a number of benefits to greater ambition, and that's really what we're focused on is getting to net zero by 2050 and within a fair share carbon budget. And those benefits obviously reduce vulnerability to physical climate risk. But in particular, one thing we've been looking at is reduced trade pressure from global trading partners. So as our global trading partners start to transition to net zero, they'll do two things. They'll provide border tariff adjustments and other trade protection mechanisms, and also they will change their demand for goods and services as they transition their technologies and their societies. And South Africa's trade is particularly vulnerable to those transitions because our top exporters are things like coal, platinum group metals, ferroalloys, the internal combustion engine, and so on. And so that's a key concern for us. And so, on one hand, there's risk, but on the other hand, there's enhanced access to markets. So if we're able to provide new commodities and particularly new green commodities into these global changing demand dynamics, then we also enhance the health of our economy. And then, of course, if we're more ambitious, we enhance access to support, all the means of implementation that are defined by the UNFCCC, intellectual property, capacity building, but especially finance and trade. And so South Africa's balance sheets, both public and private sector, are not in the best state. And so we will need some level of support in order for us to enable this transition. And that support predominantly will be through preferential finance and some grant support, and also then trade. And trade is important because if we can secure long-term trade agreements for green commodities, it reduces the risk in those investments, and therefore we are able to get a more competitive cost of capital and therefore a more competitive commodity. This is kind of the framing and why we think ambition is important, which feeds really well into our discussion on the NDC that the Presidential Climate Commission helped host over the last sort of 8 months. So jumping on to the next slide, please. So this is what South Africa's 2015 NDC looked like. So at an upper bound of 614, basically predicated on a hoped economic growth, and a lower bound of 398. And so this was then updated, and government put out a consultation draft early in 2019 that was then used to run a series of consultations. And the PCC also hosted some of those consultations alongside the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, in order to provide input into this discussion. And obviously, because of our mandate from the President, the PCC input was taken to Cabinet and considered quite carefully. So jumping on to the next slide, you will see what the proposed NDC was. And really it was to keep that lower bound to 398, that you'll see there in the middle of the slide in 2030, and then drop the 614 down to 440. So quite a big increase in ambition, but also an ambition not necessarily aligned with 1.5 degrees, or definitely not aligned with 1.53 degrees, and only marginally aligned with 2 degrees. And so there was quite a lot of pressure from various departments within South Africa to increase that ambition. And in particular, what we saw was a range of studies being done, academic studies. There was one done by the University of Cape Town. There was one done by the CSIR in South Africa. Then there was a private sector study done by the National Business Initiative and BUSA and the Boston Consulting Group. And all of those showed that you could be more ambitious. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think one of the key roles of the PCC was to bring these studies together and get some consensus and alignment around the fact that we could be more ambitious. And because of those advantages of ambition that was previously mentioned, that we ought to be more ambitious. And so the ultimate NDC that was proposed to Cabinet and approved and then submitted to the NFCCC is on the next slide. So this is what was submitted. And so we dropped that upper bound even more to 420 and then dropped the lower bound to 350. Now that lower bound is just aligned with 1.5. So if we jump onto the next slide, we'll see what the climate action tracker, sort of how they assessed the NDC. So if we could jump to the next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about this, the consensus from the 3 studies. I guess the key consensus, actually just touching on this point before we go on to the climate trackers view, is all 3 studies basically said more or less the same things. It's possible to decarbonize power. Renewables were by far the cheapest form of energy that we could transition, and that more ambitious 2030 targets were feasible. And I guess it was this inclusive conversation that made a big contribution to enhancing the ambition. So just jumping on to the next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of the view of the climate action tracker. If you take the upper bound of the NDC, they assess that to being insufficient. It's barely aligned with 2 degrees and certainly not aligned with 1.5. However, the lower bound of 1.5 degrees would probably be almost sufficient, so a little bit short of 1.5 degree Paris alignment. It would need to be, the bottom bound would need to be sort of 345 to 348 in order to be in there. So it's really borderline, quite close. And so that bottom bound really then defines the kind of ambition that you would need to have in order to secure some of those ambition benefits. And so that then becomes the focus. So the difference between the upper bound and the lower bound of the NDC is quite important, and we'll pick up on that as we go along. So the next slide, please. So you will all, many of you will have heard of the big deal that was struck just prior to COP last month, where developed countries, including the US, EU, France, Germany, the UK, committed 8.5 billion to transition away from coal. And it was interesting to hear some of the conversation around that 8.5 billion, that in fact it was predicated on aiming for the lower bound of our ambition. So it's additional support that was asked for in our NDC, and that then helps us drive towards that lower bound. And so understanding what it takes to get to the lower bound obviously becomes a key part of the national dialogue. And initially, the government priorities for that 8.5 billion, and as we've heard from the presidency, is focusing on power and transitions in power. And as the previous speaker pointed out, power in South Africa is a big part of our emissions, the biggest part by far. Electric vehicles is a key investment, and then hydrogen. And hydrogen is important because it also provides decarbonization options, but also potentially provides export options, which are important when we consider about our balance of payments and when I think about those trade points that I made earlier on. So jumping to the next slide. So if we think about what it is that we can do to achieve our NDC, I mean, 2030 is actually really close. And so there are not a lot of huge structural changes that you can make in the economy in order to drive that short-term change. And in fact, most of the modeling indicates that a lot of the change will happen post-2030. So 2030 to 2035, we see a distinct dip in the emissions curve. And so there are a couple of things we have to do now, between now and 2030. The two sectors that can influence that 2030 target are power, largely driven by the state utility ESCOM, the role of Sasol and Synfuels, which are sort of privately owned company, and then we have to sort of set the groundwork for these other sectors, start investing in electric vehicles, start investing in hydrogen and some of these, and sort of general industry issues as well. And there are a couple of key things when we think about power and the role of power in achieving that target at 2030. The role and timing of gas and alternate peaking technologies is something that's important for us to settle on in South Africa. So the studies have shown that renewable energy power grids are by far the cheapest grids and obviously also the lowest emission grids. But the role of peaking is key, and at the moment gas is seen as the dominant peaking technology, but maybe there are alternate peaking technologies like pumped hydro storage, and these are things that we still have to settle on in the economy. But really there's 4 trillion rand of investment that's required in rolling out the renewable energy infrastructure, as well as the transmission infrastructure. That's between now and 2050, but an initial start has to be made now. Thinking about stranding of new coal assets, again, this is slightly longer than the 2030 time horizon. But if we think about the difference of, so in the 2050 time horizon, our new coal plants, Medupi and Kusile, would probably be stranded. But also, if we want to get to that lower bound, we have to accelerate the decarbonization of our power plants. And so there will be some additional capital costs for closing some coal plants early, but again, it gives us access to these trade opportunities and these financial support opportunities. And then we need to start ramping up research and development on last mile technologies. And so how will we replace the peaking technology, predominantly gas, that's forecast in the system? Either we would use hydrogen or some form of carbon capture and storage. And in South Africa, carbon capture and storage is tricky because we don't really have the sink capability. So we will likely be looking at carbon capture and storage through some trade regime like Article 6 through UNFCCC. Synfuels, so that's predominantly Sasol. There's also PetroSA. They play a big role in emissions as well. Between power and synfuels, it's about 55 to 60% of total emissions. And obviously for synfuels, Sasol have set a target of net zero by 2050 and a 30% reduction by 2030. And if they're able to achieve that target, then that definitely pushes us towards the lower bound of the NDC. And so support for Sasol is important, and they plan those predominantly to transition to gas in the short term, and that's where those initial 2030 savings come from. But there are obviously also other opportunities around efficiency measures, and then finally the role of carbon capture, utilization and storage, slightly different from carbon capture and storage in that we're looking for value chain opportunities that can use carbon atoms that can also potentially create jobs and reduce inequality and unemployment. So those are kinds of the key considerations, but really the initial key focus is on power and synfuels, and then laying the groundwork for transition in other sectors like transport and hydrogen. Jumping on to the next slide, please. So there is obviously a lot that has to happen and that has to come together from a policy perspective, but also from a general planning perspective, as well as getting, as the previous speaker also pointed out, the role of public-private partnerships and the role of private sector finance. And so we often make the point that South Africa is not going to get a huge amount of international finance support. We're a middle-income country. We're not like Chad or Tuvalu or somewhere like that. And so we need to work out how we use that international finance to leverage local finance in order to get to the levels of investment that we need. So there's PPPs in kind of project implementation, but also in finance. But there are also a whole range of underlying enabling environment contexts that need to be resolved. The integrated resource plan needs to be reviewed in line of trying to get to the lower bound of the IRP, of the NDC, and at least establish what that scenario looks like. There's also the considerations on integrated energy plans, so not just power, but thinking about liquid fuels as well. And so a recent study by NBI estimated that the oil refineries in South Africa would probably close down around 2030. And so that energy input is also key. I mean, it's not really going to affect emissions so much because you're still going to be importing those liquid fuels, but it does have big implications for balance of payments and certainly how you think about the rollout and timing of battery electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. The gas master plan is key. So gas is critical to meeting those 2030 goals as we understand it now, and we hope to find alternate technologies because obviously we want to phase out all kinds of fossil fuels from the economy. But in the short term, that gas master plan is obviously a critical planning document. Electricity pricing strategies are key. So the role of Eskom's debt in all of this is a big challenge and something that we need to be able to resolve in order to be able to transition technology. And the potential restructuring of Eskom is something we need to consider more carefully from a planning perspective, and how we get sort of different sources of generation onto the grid, including small scale, which was mentioned before as well. Sector level master plans in general. So the DTIC, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, is thinking about these planning processes that are sector by sector, that are very multi-stakeholder, and these are important processes for us to engage with and start to understand how the sectors are thinking. Obviously, the renewable energy master plan is important, and iron and steel is also particularly important to start introducing efficiencies prior to 2030. Green transport strategy is important, somewhat before 2030, but more after 2030. And then, of course, carbon pricing is really important. So if you look at global forecasts for carbon pricing, they're estimating around $100 a ton by 2030. So that would probably equate to somewhere around $70 a ton in South Africa. But even at that price, you will see some quite significant changes in technologies and potentially some quite negative competitive impacts on particular sectors. And so understanding those impacts and being very nuanced about our policy support and our application of carbon pricing is going to be very important. So I guess the key message from the overall talk today is the NDC is important in driving ambition. It's particularly more important now as the UNFCCC introduced these enhanced mitigation objectives. And so we now update these NDCs and these LEDs more often, or at least we're encouraged to. And so that's on one hand a good opportunity to engage on the LEDs and the NDC. But that enhanced ambition then leads to a lot of other opportunities, including concessional finance. And what we need to do is work together as a society to understand what those investment opportunities are, the timing of them, what kind of concessional support we may get, and what kind of private sector support we will need, including thinking about how risk is carried through the economy and where the forex risk, for example, will be carried potentially some by government, some by the SARB, but South African Reserve Bank, but also we would need some international countries and donors to help support that. So these are just key things that we need to be thinking about in this planning for the 2030 and in this planning for how we leverage the 8.5 billion Rand support package. So I think that was my last slide, but I'm just jumping on to the next slide to make sure. Yeah, I mean, I've talked through these. The key realities that we have to focus on is the just transition. We cannot do this unless we focus on poverty, inequality, and employment. We have to think about the role of international finance and trade. I've talked about that quite a bit. We also need to think about resource mobilization. As we roll out these renewable energy infrastructure expansions, for example, we will need more steel, we will need more cement. Where will we get it? How will we manage the carbon emissions of those particular sectors in the context that similar kinds of mobilizations are happening all around the world? And so there may be global steel shortages, for example, and how will we cope with that in terms of our rollout plan and our investment plan? And then, of course, there's a lot of sort of political discord in South Africa and globally around things like the role of gas, the pace at which we have to roll out decommission coal, but really what we ought to be agreed on is a massive investment in renewable energy as the primary driver of our 2030 emissions reductions. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that comprehensive outlook of the South African government's plans and policies. I mean, looking at the readjustment of the NDC to show a more ambitious target was also quite encouraging. And it really showcases the country's commitment to paving a way to a more sustainable future. And indeed, I echo your words that transformation has to be looked at in a holistic view, and partnership is definitely going to be key from both private and public sector in order to achieve these targets. And with that, I would like to cue in our next speaker, Mr. Giuseppe De Benin, who is the Senior Advisory at AFRI. Giuseppe is a Senior Advisor at AFRI Management Consulting. He's currently the Vice President at ILTA-Gen SPA, a board member to Rodadini Salumi, and Senior Advisor to the International Renewable Energy Agency. He holds an MBA from the University of Yale, Hartford, and was Managing Director of ILTA-Gen between 2006 and 2020. He sits on the board of Electric SIPA Future and was Executive Committee member for RES4Med and RES4Africa between 2015 and 2018. Thank you so much, Giuseppe. I think what we look forward to in this presentation is really outlining the roadmap and the study that was commissioned by RES4Africa, which should highlight highlight the roadmap for South Africa in its ambition targets to decarbonization, but also not only looking at decarbonization of the electricity factor, but looking at holistic sectors that drive the economy, so from transportation, agriculture, as well as residential. So we definitely do look forward to your presentation because it is a tough and a tough road ahead of us. So thank you so much for your time.
So thank you, Ms. Nosy, and thanks to Roberto, let me say, for the invitation. In fact, I'm very happy to be back because even though with a different jacket, because I switched from Italcementi Group to Wayfree, where I am today. So in fact, that's my perspective, coming from approximately 20 years from the energy-intensive side of the industry. I hope that I will contribute to today's dialogue. Let me say, starting from the very challenging title. So, but also as Mr. Muzzi explained in detail on the net zero plan, I'd like to provide some international perspective coming from the study that we completed as AFRI. So please, next slide. Thank you. South Africa, as all the different guests before myself said, is one of the most important economies in Africa, and therefore is key in driving the continent transition. That for sure. But if we jump immediately on the last two cakes on the left side, you see that's 928 compared to 450 of the G20 is amazing. So this has to be faced, as all the friends said. All the major KPIs are there, and definitely it means that we are at the right place. We are at the right place, that for sure, and the continent should be and has the relevancy to be the continent, let's say, the example for the continent transition. So that as a starting point. On the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. South Africa has the most carbon-intensive economy among the G20, mainly due to the massive use of the coal in the power generation and sector industry. And that is very easy to be seen on the two very simple graphs that we saw. And if you see on the left side, the worst carbon performer in the G20. But what's on the other side is also self-explanatory, is that over 50% of the South Africa emission come from the power generation. So there is a problem. We identify what is the problem, and coal is also the most dominant energy source in all other main sectors. So as you see, the power generation is basically based on coal. So it's nothing new, but this is something that we have to face. I'd say that we have room for improvement, and it's nothing new to the local government. And that we can see that in the next slide, please. In the next slide, please, we can see that. In fact, as also Steve said, over the years, the South African government has tried to face this issue of the emission by adopting the Carbonization initiative. A lot of work. I made a very simple mathematical analysis, that very simple, meaning that we had 7 political initiatives over the last 17 years. It means 1 every 30 months. 1 every 30 months, it's a lot of work, meaning that it's demonstrating the long-term commitment coming from the government. But as Mr. Muzzi and Steve said, both of them, I would like to see maybe less acts and plan, and to see more effective and executive regulation. This is a very common, let's say, I wouldn't say mistake, but this is a very common lack of, meaning that we saw in many different countries in Africa, especially in the African continent, a lot of very ambitious regulation, even too much ambitious, and Steve was saying before that we should be more ambitious on our side here. But I have to say that what is lacking very frequently is then the executive regulation. What do I mean? I mean that then when you go in the ground and you try to attract foreign direct investor, then the executive regulation start to be a very relevant problem, meaning that you cannot get to the end of the commercial operation date. So there is something missing, and that is a very common. And we saw that in many studies, even from the foundation, when I remember very well the excellent work done on, as a title having why only 2%. And that is, in my opinion, one of the motivation of that. On the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. As we said, a lot of work, but despite this effort, South Africa is not on track to respect the 1.5 target in concert with the G20 countries. Power carbon intensity is still rising. In fact, if you see on the left graph, you see that differently from the other major reference countries in the geography, South Africa is in counter trend in terms of emission intensity. And that's I would say, is inconsistent with the Renewable Energy Policy and Act. So again, if we move on the right side, you see that the ambition, the gap between the ambition and the expectation is quite consistent. So it means that something, we are on the right track, but we have to change the speed in the execution, I would say. And we see that on the next slide, please. If we move on the next slide, thank you, that it means that we are risking to lose, together with the, let's say, we put a just and sustainable future, we need to work also in attractiveness for greening investment. I was very happy and I read that, and going back to the 8.5 billions that Steve said already secure, that is a lot of money that has to be executed, that has to be used. Therefore, if you see the new opportunity are very cross-lateral. They are not touching only the energy, but they are touching the energy, the transport, the market creation, meaning market regulation, but touching also the building. So as they are very cross-cultural, cross-sector in the old system. And of course, the consequences of missing this green transition, of course, it's very easy to say, but not so easy to implement. The attracting investors, to have some economy that will be left behind. So as already Mr. Kutsi said at the beginning, let's take into consideration the social impact of this, and that's to be faced. So meaning that this competitive power has to be faced from not only from the plant side, but also from all the impact that this transition will touch, especially on the people. And that I'm jumping already very quickly on my final remarks, meaning that on the next slide, please. South Africa should then catch the opportunity of the carbonization process across its economic sectors, meaning has to have a systematic approach touching the power generation, the transport, residential, the tertiary, industrial, and agriculture. And of course, with some, let me say, with some priorities and some urgency, and that we can see that on the next slide, please. Because if we move to the next, therefore, as we said, the current policy should be strengthened to eat the 1.5 target. In fact, as you see, according to our scenario, the blue one is the government scenario, while the green one is the Paris scenario. You see that there is still a gap to be completed. So what does it mean? That we are on the right track, but maybe we are not pushing on the accelerator as we should. But again, this is something that already Stephen and Tsutsi said at the beginning before myself. Finally, the target, next slide, please. The target can be reached through the transition in all, as you see, in all the different contributions coming from the different sectors. And as you see, we have to be more ambitious. In that sense, I fully agree with Steve, because if we go to the policy scenario, the scenario to 2030 is providing us a -23, while the scenario to 2050 is providing us a result of -38. But it's not enough. So that's why the green development scenario should be on top of the agenda, because the effect of that would provide a -32 up to 2030, but up to -73% up to 2050. Where that and how that and which kind of priority? Okay, I understand that we got 8.5 billion, so that's a very huge amount of money. It's like in Europe that we are getting a lot of money that has to be very properly dispersed. But again, in terms of...
Sorry, Giuseppe. Apologies for the interruption. I just wanted to be cognizant of time so that we do give Raphael some time before our next speaker. So if we could please just wrap it up, because we are going to be sharing the report.
Yeah, but I'm already done. I'm already at the conclusion. So thank you. So again, the priorities are here. So in my opinion, meaning that power generation coal phase out is one of the first priority, and that will have already a strong impact on the social impact. So as we said, so be careful on the 90,000 people that currently working on the mining sector. And industry, electrification and energy efficiency, and as Steve said, electrical vehicles should also be on the agenda. And finally, and please on the next and last slide, decarbonization and liberalization, in our opinion, of the power sector will be the short-term key enabler of transition, supported by intervention across all the sector, as we said, for its long-term sustainability, where, as we said, the power sector reform and the liberalization is the key enabler, and the deep revision of the market design, and again, as they said, electrification on renewable and the revolution on the transport. Finally, I would say that this ingredient should also be fitting with what Mr. Nuzzi said, that could reduce poverty, could reduce inequality, and could reduce the unemployment rate, because that would create some robust new industry in all the different sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I do apologize for rushing through. It's just that we obviously have to cue our next speaker, so thank you so much. And with that, without wasting any further time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Raphael Patricione, who is the Director General at Climate Action European Commission. He has been the Director General at DG Climate since 2018. He joined the European Commission in 1987 and has worked in trade policy since then, covering topics such as investment, WTO, dispute settlement, and relations between member states and the European institution. With that, I would like to hand over the presentation to you. We definitely do look forward to the 8.5 billion that has been talked about over the last couple of months as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and good morning, everybody. And I wish to thank the organizer for inviting me to this webinar. I will try to give you a very brief view of how this joint energy transition partnership came about and what we will try to do. I mean, first of all, why this partnership? Why South Africa? To begin with, Africa is a potential challenge for climate policy and for our efforts to stop climate change across the world. Africa has a huge developmental challenge, which is to power its economy, to power a growing population and a very dynamic population. And the idea that Africa would power that through fossil fuels following the same development pattern that others have followed would probably completely negate efforts to stop climate change. At the same time, that challenge has to be met. So how do we power Africa without going through fossil fuels? In that context, South Africa is very important. South Africa is in a unique situation of having abundant energy in the form of coal, yet going through a very serious energy crisis because the South Africa requires important investment to be renewed and kept afloat. And it also has some of the biggest potential for wind and solar on the African continent. So how do we transform a potential crisis into great opportunity? It's a huge challenge. It's a challenge that cannot be met by a country alone. It cannot be met by international partners intervening either. Hence, the notion of this partnership that would start with the energy system, but would look over time to make this renewed green energy system in South Africa the heart of a renewed economy, capable of creating new jobs, more energy for the economy. One of the easy avenues to look at is the potential South Africa, for instance, has to become a producer and exporter of green hydrogen. Now, how are we going to try to do it, and how did this partnership came about? Let me start at the outset that without the initiative of the South African government, this would have never come together. The role that President Ramaphosa, Minister Creasy, the Presidential Climate Change Commission played in fostering this was absolutely crucial, which leads to the fundamental point. There's a reason why this is a partnership. No partnership can succeed if it is not deeply rooted in the country and in the country's willingness to change, in the country's ability to give itself a plan for change. We've had this political declaration signed in Glasgow by the government of South Africa, European Union, the US, the UK, France, and Germany. Now we have a lot of technical work in front of us to make this political declaration into an actual plan. The chair mentioned the 8.5 billion. That is the beginning of the story, certainly not the end of the story. There are three fundamental elements in partnership that need to come together, and that's what we try to do. I mean, the first is resource mobilization. Can we bring in the right mix of public support, international partners backing up the efforts the South African government itself is trying to do to invest in its energy system, and come up with the right mix between public funds, whether they are from the country or from international partners, and private investment. The second fundamental element is, how do we create in South Africa, or better, how does South Africa create an environment where foreign investors feel comfortable, are willing to invest, sink their resources, bring their expertise, but it has to be a way that fits with how South Africa sees its own economic development, the development of its own economy over the next few decades, in the framework that President Ramaphosa has confirmed at Glasgow of decarbonizing progressively the South African economy, the way we are trying to do in Europe or the United States is also trying to do. This is going to be crucial to the success of the enterprise, and it is a long-term goal. Some of those reforms are happening without the efforts that South Africa is making to reform the way ESCOM works, the unbundling and moving to a different structure of the energy market. This would not have been possible. But there's still a long road to go. And as I said, the driver on that road has to be South Africa, but the international partners are there to support, are there to offer their expertise, are there to offer our knowledge on how do you move to a more efficient way of organizing the energy market. And the third is just transition. That's why just is in the title of the partnership, because the climate and energy transition everywhere in the world has to be made together with the people. Changing the energy system, investing in new infrastructure, it's a matter of money, it's a matter of organization, it's a matter of regulation. But the fundamental element is to bring people along with that change and make sure that they see that as an opportunity and not a challenge. Obviously, this is a challenge for the mining communities of a country like South Africa, as it is a challenge for the mining community that we still have in Europe. On the other hand, today, mining communities are people who are perfectly capable of seizing other opportunities if we're able to offer them. So the fundamental third element of the third leg of this partnership is, how do we organize our support to South Africa to create new jobs, better jobs for those communities, and an alternative to what we've been doing so far. We have some experience of that in Europe. We're going through that in different member states, in different situations. Of course, every country is different, every country is unique, but some of the problems are similar, and therefore some of the solutions can be adapted or can serve as a source of inspiration for that change. Finally, will there be a need for more resources? Will there be a need for more support? Yes, almost certainly yes. The important thing is that this partnership supports South Africa in setting up its long-term plan, the transformation of its energy system towards one which is decarbonized, but it's also efficient and it's capable of powering effectively a growing and vibrant economy. If we can manage to offer that support, and if we come up with that plan, which I insist once again has to be fundamentally a South African plan, then new resources will be made available and will be found over time. Many are seeing this as a blueprint, and again, the situation in South Africa cannot be replicated identically elsewhere, but there are similarities, there are inspirations. And yes, we want this to be a blueprint. We want this to be a new method of how the international community can get together in a country who is trying to operate what we know very well for our experience is very difficult change. Blueprint for other African countries, but also there's great interest generated elsewhere in places as far away as India or Indonesia or Latin America. This is therefore a very important experiment in our fight to stop climate change. Mr. Chairperson, I will stop here, and good luck for the continuation of the seminar.
Thank you so much, and also for the timing was absolutely perfect. So I really do appreciate that, and it is we definitely and it is encouraging that South Africa and this partnership is said to be the blueprint in terms of how countries can actually work together to fight climate change, because it is indeed a threat to humanity. So thank you so much for that. And with that point, I would like to then introduce my next speaker, Mr. Salvatore Benabe. He is the CEO of Enel Green Power and head of Global Generation Division, the Enel business line that manages energy generation from both conventional and through EGP's renewable sources. He is also the head of Africa, Asia, Oceania for the Enel Group. In terms of what Mr. Benabe will be speaking about, he is going to be covering the green energy at the core and how renewable technologies can bring economic growth and job creation. And this is quite prevalent if you look at the IRP 2019 target, which has set the decommissioning of about 11 gigawatt of coal generation by 2030. And has also set a target to decommission about 35 gigawatt of coal generation by 2050, while bringing additional renewable capacity through, under solar and wind generation as well. So, and this has been seen through the procurement of the IRP, through the REAP program that has been run by the Department of Mineral and Energy in South Africa. And with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Benabe. I think there seems to be a slight delay in terms of our next speaker.
I think Mr. Benabe is having some issues connecting.
Okay, while we are trying to connect with Mr. Benabe, I would like to then introduce Peter, who is the co-head debt finance at Nedbank. Peter, if you are able to join while we're trying to connect Mr. Benabe.
Yes.
Right.
Morning.
Thank you so much for that adjustment. So, let me just do a quick introduction of your bio, and then I'll leave the floor to you. So Peter is currently the co-head debt finance at Nedbank Corporate Investment Bank. For debt finance houses many of the specialist lending businesses within Nedbank CIB, including mining, finance, oil and gas finance, infrastructure, and TMT finance, energy, and leveraged and diversified finance. Peter has 20 years of investment banking experience in structured lending, M&A, and project finance in South Africa and Africa. He is passionate about innovating and developing financing solutions with which drives growth and creates value for all stakeholders. Peter holds a degree in civil engineering and an MBA. And Peter, I mean, we've been speaking about just transition. We've spoken about policy. We've the roadmap in order for South Africa to reach the decarbonization goal. But at the end of the day, it all needs to be financed. And the question is, do we have enough capacity locally by commercial banks to undertake this task in financing these projects? And what else can be done in terms of gathering other supports from the likes of DFIs that can assist commercial banks in funding these projects? So I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to focus today on debt within the power sector, on the basis that debt really is the lion's share of the financing that's required for the just energy transition. If we could go to the next slide. From our perspective, the financing required in support of the transition is huge. The numbers are all arguable, but we see a number of 336 billion within the next 10 years in delivering on the renewable energy procurement, which drives this transition. But to cut straight to the chase, our view is that there is sufficient domestic and international liquidity to fund this transition. But it's important that we broaden the sources of that funding beyond the usual suspects, beyond the commercial banks. And then secondly, and as importantly, we need to also broaden the sectors in which we deploy this, because at the moment, a lot of the deployment has gone into the utility scale programs like REAP, where all the South African banks are very much invested. But if we're going to achieve these transitional goals, we really need to drive it deeper into the economy, and we need to drive it deeper into corporate South Africa and potentially even the man on the street. So just to give you a quick update as to where we are from a financing perspective in the South African context, we see significant liquidity chasing the current REAP program and projects. And that program has supported the commercial banks within South Africa to build up the capacity and the project financing capacity to support this financing. So if you take in as Nedbank as an example, we have a dedicated energy team with 12 transactors. We have limits for REAP of 50 billion rand in terms of a hold position, and that means if we're distributing our debt, we can support hundreds of billions of rands worth of projects. What we also see, given the expertise that we have within the South African commercial banks, now that we're seeing large-scale projects coming in the C&I space, the banks are able to start supporting those projects. But it's important to note that at the moment, it's really around your high credit quality blue chip off-takers, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. We then see significant support from the international DFIs in what we call the traditional space, like REAP, where we have not seen as much support from the DFIs is in the small-scale C&I space. Obviously a difficult space where projects are small, but that's where we want to see more support, and again, I'll touch on that a little later. From a capital markets perspective, we are seeing institutional appetite for REAP project debt. Again, REAP projects are now well known, they're performing well, and so the institutions like the asset class and have a lot of institutional appetite for it. But we're largely seeing those institutions playing in in the secondary market, i.e., buying it from the banks, and they're playing in the primary debt. So what we haven't seen is a kind of a secondary market or instruments being created which support a broader participation by the institutional market. And those are things like listed project bonds and the like, which become tradable and therefore much more applicable for the institutional market. The transitional funding that we've seen from the international markets, has started to be deployed in South Africa, but today it's largely behind, again, the commercial banks. As an example, as Nedbank, we have IFC funding, which we utilize to support deployment into our REAP assets and other assets. These institutions use us as a platform, and we wear the capital risk or the risk around the assets. So that's where we are at the moment. Obviously, that's got to broaden out quite significantly to achieve the financing of the goals. If we can move on to the next slide, I think it's important to recognize that there's a couple of pillars that we need to really focus on in delivering on the decarbonisation goals. We've spoken a lot about REAP and the established program of REAP, which has run for better part of 10 years now. What we require there is a continuation of that program and the consistency around that program. That supports us as commercial banks in maintaining the large teams that we have, but it also supports our equity investors and developers, housing teams on the ground in South Africa. And so consistency of those programs is absolutely key. And then investing in grid capacity to support this is another very important aspect, and I'll touch on that a little later. Then, I think the next sector where we really need to build out and develop is the C&I space. And we are seeing a lot of activity in the South African context at the moment. The importance of this is that it's not premised on government support and utilizes the balance sheets of corporate South Africa to support the transition. So the two key things there is a clear and stable regulatory framework, and then broadening the accessibility of embedded generation to more corporates, and that is driving it beyond just the big blue chips, but having every corporate in South Africa embarking on that journey. And then lastly, something that's not spoken about a lot and an area where we need to put a lot of energy is in energy efficiency, and that's about how do we develop financing methodologies and platforms for financing energy efficiency, because that obviously is probably your most effective and easiest way to decarbonize. If we could move on to the next slide. So I think any presentation in relation to a transition from at least a utility scale perspective is to touch on grid capacity concerns. And as we all know, with the Northern Cape being one of the best regions for solar irradiation, we have a lot of projects that are ready to be deployed in the Northern Cape. But looking forward, we're pretty much out of capacity. And so one of the big issues is how do we finance the transmission expansion? And it's a really difficult one. As commercial banks, obviously the most difficult area to focus on. If you look at the investment in the next 10 years, the numbers span from about 120 to 170 billion rand that needs to be spent on strengthening the grid. We really need to find a mechanism that enables the financing of this if you look at the size of the numbers, it's not something that that the commercial banks within the South African context can do on their own. And hopefully a revenue mechanism can support the debt capital markets being brought to bear in financing this. And again, we've talked about the $8.5 billion that Steve mentioned, and we would hope that some of that would go to unlocking that transmission infrastructure, and then again, off the back of that, the commercial lenders can play a role again in supporting those IPP projects in those regions. If we could move on to the next slide. I'm going to spend a lot more time on embedded generation as an unlock of the transition, because this really is the space that I think you can get a lot of impact quite quickly on the basis that you're crowding in the private sector balance sheets and not using government support for programs. So the first key piece is regulatory certainty. As bankers, we're very focused on risk, and regulatory certainty is the key underpin for our ability to provide long-term investments. Secondly, and I think this was raised previously, the huge unlock is around liberalizing the energy sector. And we've seen that, Muzi touched on the unlock from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. And for us, that's been it really has been a major unlock. We built, 5 years ago, we started building an embedded generation business which finances small projects in the C&I space, and we were limited to 1 megawatt. So our ability to deploy finance into our client base was extremely limited, albeit that we had a platform that was extremely scalable. With that unlock from 1 megawatt to 100, in terms of licensing, our book in that space has rocketed. A number of projects that had been limited to 1 megawatt were now upsized to 5 to 10. And then on top of that, within the mining sector, we're seeing utility scale type projects. And again, those projects, we are as South African commercial banks able to finance those projects because we can take a view on the balance sheet and businesses of the mining companies, which are counterparties to those PPAs. But beyond that, I think further liberalization again supports us in providing more innovative funding mechanisms for the sector. And that's enabling things like energy trading, mini grids, wheeling, which we're now starting to see. And I think to double click on wheeling, one of the most important aspects of wheeling is that as it stands now in a non-fully liberalized energy market, when we finance these projects, we're ultimately taking a risk view against the off-taker behind the PPA. And that's on the basis that, there isn't a merchant market that supports reselling the power to the extent that there's default by the purchaser. But with wheeling, that's the first step in terms of liberalization. And what we can start doing is mitigating that risk around stranded assets. So as an example, where we have a project that has been built off-site of a company and power is wheeled to that company, to the extent that company or counterparty defaults or is bankrupted, we're comfortable that through the wheeling arrangements, we can sell that power elsewhere. And that's a really huge unlock for us as funders in the sector, and enables us to do a number of things. And maybe I can talk to that on the next slide. Great. So as I alluded to, really when we're looking at financing within the embedded space, the credit rating of the counterparty is absolutely key. That drives three important things: bankability, which means we may not even be able to support a project to the extent that we cannot form a credit view on that counterparty. Pricing is a function of that credit rating and in many instances can be punitive. And then tenors are restricted when you're looking at a single counterparty. And the problem you have there is that whilst you might be deploying a 25-year asset, commercial lenders might be only willing to take a 5-year view on a corporate. And that introduces a lot of issues in providing a financing which supports a project and a tariff that is attractive to a corporate. And that's where we believe that DFIs can...
Sorry, Peter, I'm just going to
Yes.
have to be cognizant of time. If we could just quickly wrap it up. Thank you.
Right, okay, no problem. So I think in this respect, DFIs can play a significant role in unlocking the embedded generation space and supporting the funding platforms that we've put in place. I then quickly just want to touch on the last aspect, which is ways of funding corporates on balance sheet and not through, the traditional project finance. The first is sustainable linked loans, where we look to provide funding discounts for various KPIs or sustainability KPIs in relation to that company's ambitions. And one of those KPIs are transitional metrics. And then secondly, use of proceeds, where we fund the corporate directly for a sustainability project, and through the direct funding on their balance sheet, we can seek to provide increased tenor. I'll leave out the last piece on energy efficiency in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I do apologize. And if we do have time post, I think we can revisit just this last slide. With that,
no problem. Thank you.
To hand over to Salvatore Benabe. I've already done his introduction. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nontokoso. Good morning to everyone. Sorry, but I'm having some connection problems. So I don't know if you hear me well, but please give me a feedback in case you don't feel my voice. So good morning for inviting me to this event. I wanted to be here for this event, Decarbonization Roadmap for South Africa. South Africa is the largest electricity market in Africa. And I think it feels also responsibility of being the first mover in Africa to make things happen towards a future that's more decarbonized. We have been discussing in the latest weeks about the next decade, I mean the current decade, the 2021-2030. In the COP, at the COP 2026, at the COP at Glasgow this year, it was said that the decarbonization, the process of decarbonization and electrification will be key for the future of our world. My personal beliefs and the belief of Enel is that in some part of the world, the current decade has been the decades of renewables, and this one, the 2021-2030, will be the decades of electrification. Saying that today, most of the countries in the world have understood that renewables are competitive. And so now what we have to do is to use the benefits of these new sources of electricity, new respect to the fossil fuel, obviously, to electrify the consumption so that we could also amplify the benefits. Thanks to the lower cost of the renewables, we could also use some appliances or new uses of the electricity that could help the cities to be more sustainable, or could also help in the decarbonization. When it comes to Africa, perhaps things are a bit different. Some countries, like South Africa, are understanding before than others that the renewables are a solution to the problem. But we cannot say that the past decade has been the decade of renewables in Africa. We have to say that this decade has to be the decade of renewables in Africa and in South Africa. But at the same time, as we want also Africa to recover respect to the rest of the world, our commitment should be the one of saying that in the meantime that we help to happen this transition in South Africa and Africa, we also electrify at the same time. I think that in Africa there are some of the elements of the condition to make it happen. There is for sure the resource, the renewable resource. Some other pieces of the puzzle are missing, like the one, for instance, of having the risking framework. But I think you have spoke about this in this event. I want only to mention also that going under a transition like the scenario that South Africa is facing is complicated, because there could be some impact on the social sphere, but countries are usually reluctant to do the switch from fossil fuel, from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized, because they feel there is some social issue to be managed. This is true, but we also have to remind that at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, Western nations have announced 8.5 billion partnership with South Africa to help the transformation of the country into a clean energy economy in the next 3 to 5 years. So my point is that there is also the support of the international community to South Africa to make this energy transition easier. The help of the international community will be then materialized in a combination of financial instruments and technical support to enable the just transition. So we cannot say there is not an issue of just transition. There is an issue of just transition, but there are also the willingness of the international community to help South Africa, and there is also the experience of some company like ours, like Enel, that have already undergone this process of energy transition. As Enel, we have already shut down more than 11 gigawatt of coal plants, and we have still to decommission in the next 3 years 9 more additional gigawatt of coal capacity. And whilst we were doing this, we already faced these social problems that someone first could be also be faced in South Africa. And the message I want to tell you is that it's possible to overcome this problem. It's possible to overcome it if everyone do its part, if there is dialogue, if there is openness to different solutions. Just a couple of examples. In the sites, in the physical sites where we operated our coal plants, we dialogued with the territory, with the local communities to define together what could be the next future of these sites. And the result of the different dialogue in more than 40 coal plants that we had worldwide is that at the end, each one of these sites will have a different future. So in some cases, we gave a future that was just repurposing the plant for a different use, completely different use. In some cases, we launched also a tourism activity on these sites where we had the coal plants. Now there will be a resort in some part of Italy, for instance. In some other cases, we decided to install a center for R&D. In some other cases, we created what we call the pole of the generation of the future. So by listening to the territory, we said, look, from one end, the territory wants to create new activities here. So there are a lot of entrepreneurs with a lot of ideas, and we want to help them to make it happen. So by leveraging on that idea, by leveraging of the need of our society, that is the need of new renewables, but also the need of new economy that we call circular, in some other sites, we said, look, we will install here photovoltaic plants plus batteries, where before there was a coal plant. But we will also install, for instance, hydroponic warehouses, because someone wants to launch this business. Or, for instance, we'll also organize the collecting of blades that are coming from wind farms that are being decommissioned because they are at the end of their useful life, and we will put into operation and initiatives to obtain from these blades materials that could be used in the building activity, in the construction activity, for instance, in making new roads. So my point is that all of these initiatives in these new poles of the generation that combines new source of renewables generation together with the new activities that then brings benefits to the territory, and so then creates job, has been possible by opening a dialogue with the territory. So the issue of the jobs should not be an issue, a problem that prevent us from speaking and from finding a new solution. And I want to come at the end of my speech here with the works that has been done by Enel Foundation, by AFRI, in defining the study that has been presenting to this event. So I've said that Africa and South Africa is, South Africa more than Africa is facing this energy dilemma of finding the way to conciliate, to balance the different needs of energy security, social equity, environmental sustainability. But to guide this transition, Enel RES4Africa engaged the institution and the other stakeholders to develop the South Africa energy transition roadmap. So we did the study that we presented to this event, and I would like just to resume 3 points that are coming from this study. So South African stakeholders should focus on building an electricity market that fit for renewable energy sources and energy storage through a secure and well-regulated competitive framework that will help us not only to develop renewables, but also to develop the business, the battery energy system regulation that currently are very deficient in South Africa. But we have also to work on reinforcing the grid capacity, because otherwise the absence of a grid reinforcement or grid development could be a barrier for the renewables. And at the end, we will also need a work to encourage the development of renewables in coal areas. These are main elements coming from our analysis, from our study, but they will be just enabler to create a new economy. And this new economy will be possible if there is a dialogue among the stakeholders on a certain territory. We, as Enel, are one of the main players in South Africa in building renewables. And we would like also to put at disposal of the South African country our expertise in facing the challenges of the energy transition, in shutting down coal plants, in managing what happens to the surrounding, to the contractors that were accustomed to work only for coal plants. A last piece of information. What we are doing as Enel is speaking with all the contractors that used to work in our coal plants and training also them, launching some program to develop a new capability to reskill their people. And what we are doing is says, dear contractors, until yesterday you had these competences and this capability, only coal plant related. I help you to reskill your people, and I also invite you to work with me in installing e-chargers for the vehicles, in installing renewable plants, in installing and building new grids, new transmission and distribution grids. So our role is a very active role within the territory where we operate, and we put at disposal of the South African country also our expertise together with our capability of developing renewables and battery energy storage. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I think that was quite a nice and roundup of the discussions that we've had today. And just to quickly summarize, some of the key points that that have come through all the speakers is that reducing carbon emission is necessary. And we need to look at it from a holistic perspective where clear and updated policy and regulation which will foster this transition. It also needs to be supported by implementable and a clear strategy supported by international community. And in order to reach the fair and just goal, an open dialogue has to be held in order to achieve this. And with that, I would like to close the session and invite our colleagues from RES4Africa in case they do have any closing remarks. And thank you to everyone who has joined us, and we apologize in advance for the delay in time as well as running over, but it was quite a necessary conversation to be held. And thank you to all our speakers as well. I now hand over to Roberto to provide the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Nonti, for your conduction. I really think this was a very exceptional event because we had a variety of input from the government, from the regulator, from the banks, particularly from the Commission. We presented a very short overview of the study. You will be reached by email, all of you, all attending, where you can download quickly the study, very interesting study. You know, from our website, I want to inform you, you can download everything we have with no password and no registration, because I think innovation, the more people know what we do, the better it is for everybody. And also, I appreciate very much also the final intervention of my president and also CEO of Enel Green Power on the practical instrument, the practical action that can be shared with the South Africa. And in fact, as you may know, we are also part of the Reskilling Lab that South Africa is now launching, and we will bring not only Enel, but also other companies, Siemens Gamesa, EDP Portugal, United Electric, all the other track record on reskilling personnel in this reskilling lab. So once again, I think we have a blend of theoretical things, of policy, regulator, and practical action that only private sector can really enhance. So I want to say the exact date of the South Africa Transition Day is the 2nd of March. On the 2nd of March, we shall have a special edition of our advanced training course dedicated to just energy transition in South Africa. And therefore, I expect that we are going to replicate this for the benefit of more than 330 African attendants, young talent in the countries. And therefore, we can also make a check after 3 months what's happening in the meanwhile. So I think now, Nonti, thank you so much to you. Thank you to the speaker. And really glad to be again supporting South Africa in this exciting, difficult, challenging, but mandatory scope. See you next time, and then take care all of you, and hope to come to South Africa. Inshallah, maybe next year we hope to come in person there. Arrivederci, we say arrivederci.
Thank you so much.